Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Andreoni from IIPP, and we'll be chairing this session. Tonight, we have Professor Fulvio Castellacci from the University of Oslo, in particular the Center for Technology, Innovation and Culture. We will be giving our third seminar for this term, and the presentation will be followed by a discussion with Professor Rainer Kattel from IIPP. And later on, as I already mentioned, we will be having a Q&A session and a full discussion. And I invite you all to join the discussion with the usual raise hand function. I will be, and also you can use the Q&A chat function so that we can collect all your comments, questions, and those of you who are keen to engage directly the speakers tonight can do so by joining the panel as well. I have just a few words about Fulvio's work. Fulvio has a very strong publication track and research in the one of the most important topics for IIPP, which is of course innovation and firms, dynamics of innovation, and in particular tonight is actually bringing in this important dimension, which is not simply looking at innovation and technological change, but also the interface between innovation and social welfare. So this is a very much central topic for an institute which is called Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. So we are particularly pleased to have you tonight and to engage in this discussion. Fulvio has done quite a lot of work using very different methodologies and has contributed in a number of journals and websites. We have a full bio of his work. And I think what I really appreciate is the fact that you've been always working very much trying to unpack lots of the complex heterogeneity involved, of course, in many of the phenomena of technological change and innovation. And it seems that these new research agenda very much complement a number of research lines followed over the last years. So without further ado, Fulvio, the floor is yours. As usual, we will give the speaker around 40 minutes. And after that, we'll have 10 minutes discussion from Rainer, and then we will open the panel. The floor is yours. Thanks again for accepting our invitation.
And thanks to you, Antonio. It's my pleasure to be here in London, digitally, but in Oslo, physically, from the University of Oslo. So very nice to meet you all. And I will now begin my talk and share the screen. The topic of this talk will be on the effects of innovation on social welfare and how, in my opinion, these should be studied in future research. Let us begin and say that one general motivation for the field of innovation is that we all believe, scholars, policymakers in the field of innovation, we are motivated by the understanding that innovation contributes to address societal challenges, foster welfare, improve human welfare. In some way or another, all of us are motivated by these general statements. However, behind these general statements, the entry points and motivation of this paper is that most research and policy making in these fields has, however, adopted a rather narrow definition of what social welfare means. I will now explain why I believe this is a narrow notion. The notion is narrow because it's based on two important assumptions that so far have dominated both academic research, but also policy making and many of the programs in the field of innovation policy. So I think, and I argue that there is a twin research challenge, which more or less is implicit behind the concept of social welfare, and that we should try and begin to unpack. When I say a twin challenge, it means that there are two components, two challenges, which are closely related to each other. The first one is that Much research so far in the field of innovation studies, and particularly in the economics of innovation, has so far had the focus on bias on economic effects of innovation. The general assumption is that new technologies affect individuals' well-being by increasing individuals' income and consumption possibilities. So GDP per capita, consumption are the key arguments of the utility functions of individuals. We know that this type of assumption originates from a mainstream economics framework in which agents' well-being is obtained by means of preference satisfaction. So this is one of the core proposition and assumption within mainstream microeconomics. However, in the field of innovation studies, although we have been critical to many propositions and theories within mainstream economics, we have not really attacked and we have not really critically analyzed this main assumption. So if you think about theoretical models in new growth theory, models within evolutionary economics, but also empirical studies studying the welfare effects of innovation, it looks like, and my reading of the literature is that all of this literature has implicitly adopted this main narrow definition of social welfare. That is welfare, which is corresponds to a growth on income and growth of consumption possibilities of individuals. So a definition of welfare that corresponds with preference satisfaction. Why is this a challenge? There are two related problems here. There is a lot of literature which shows that higher income and consumption possibilities do not always and not necessarily translate into greater well-being. This is sometimes the case, but often it is not the case. First of all, there is literature within studies of happiness, well-being, and so on, showing that individuals do not really care about the absolute income, that is the absolute level of wage or consumption that they achieve and have. But even more important for individuals is often the relative income, that is the relative position that each of us has in relation to our peers, family, colleagues, close peers. And the main point here that has seldom been analyzed in the literature is that innovation, you may think, it continuously affects the relative income of individuals and social groups. And the consequences in terms of individuals' well-being are not at all clear. They can be very complex. I will present some examples later to extend these points. And in addition to that, it is also known from the same literature that individual well-being is subject to adaptation effects, which means that each of us tend to rapidly adapt to the given level of material well-being, consumption that we have. And that a continuously increasing level of consumption and well-being does not deliver higher well-being in a stable and steady way. So if we reflect about innovation, product variety, incremental innovations do not really lead to permanent effects on well-being. But according to this literature, they tend to provide temporary increase in our enjoyment of higher consumption possibilities, but no stable increase in well-being. Then there is a second problem in this narrow definition of individual well-being. The other problem is also that agents' well-being is known to be shaped by a variety of other dimensions in addition to consumption and income, a variety of dimensions which are by definition non-economic. Typical examples and big dimensions which are studied in the literature, the determinants of individual well-being are, for example, related to a broad range of different factors. For example, in our working life, the quality of the workplace, the quality of working relationships that we have is very important. The quality of social relationships family life, leisure, personal life that we have. And then the physical environment and the social institutional environment that characterizes the place and the society where we live. So there is a huge variety of literature within studies of subjective well-being and happiness, which points out convincingly how broad the concept of well-being is and how broad the range of determinants. So the dimensions that I note here cannot be measured by means of monetary metrics only. We can try, and some economists try to convert some of these dimensions into income measures, but this is very often hard to do. And think that innovations may affect each of these dimensions in a variety of ways. Innovation can affect quality of the workplace, social relationships, physical, social institutional environment, and so on. So the bottom line here is that the first challenge is important because there is a need to adopt a broader definition of individuals' well-being, which should go beyond a narrow definition based on income and consumption possibilities of individuals. The second challenge that I point out to motivate this paper is that the literature that we are interested in innovation has a more or less implicit bias on efficiency effects of innovation. So in other words, the assumption is that innovation improves social welfare if its overall net effects are positive. This is implicitly based on a type of conceptual framework which also originates within mainstream economics, which is based on a so-called simple utilitarian way to define social welfare. Simple utilitarian, it means that social welfare is defined as the simple sum of individuals' well-being. So basically, in the literature that we are interested in within innovation studies, the economics of innovation, what we often do is that we have conceptual models and the empirical econometric studies where we focus on overall net effects of innovation. We agree that there is some turbulence, a process of creative destruction, but in all literature that we can think about of our interest, there is often a focus on net effects. As long as an innovation has a positive effects on GDP per capita, economic growth, productivity, employment, as long as this net effects is positive, we tend to conclude in our research that innovation has a positive effect on a given variable. So why is this a challenge? Well, it is often the case that bright and dark sides of innovation often come together. The process of Schumpeterian creative destruction, it's important, and we know the same innovation will often have positive impacts for some individuals, social groups or firms, and negative impacts for others. But although we often agree on these Schumpeterian insights, we tend to focus on the positive effects and often neglect the dark sides. The negative impacts of innovation, however, they are also important because sometimes they can be persistent. They can affect income distribution in ways that are difficult to reverse and therefore generate processes of polarization, increasing inequality, and so on. So the second bottom line here is that given this challenge, it is important to consider distributional impacts and equity issues in innovation research alongside the efficiency effects. Efficiency effects are very important. The growth of GDP, consumption, international trade, competitiveness. I realize, and I'm in line with all literature that says that these are important. But at the same time, this should be considered alongside the distributional impacts of innovation. So motivated by these two challenges, the paper discusses and proposes a new research agenda. The idea of the new agenda is to seek to study the effects of innovation on social welfare, adopting a broader notion of social welfare. So there would be ideally two dimensions, two pillars in developing this agenda. The first one is to study together economic and non-economic effects of innovation on well-being. That is, adopting a broader view of what well-being is for individuals. And the second part would be to focus alongside efficiency and income and consumption growth, but also drive the attention to distributional impacts of innovation, and often the related trade-offs, contrasts that can also often arise between efficiency and equity. So the idea of this agenda, which I will try to expose now in this presentation, is that is a micro to macro type of narrative. There is first of all, a macro building block, which is definition and study of individual well-being and how innovation affects agents' well-being. And then the second part would be the study of more aggregate aspects, that is the study of macro aspects and implications of this. That is the notion of social welfare, which is by definition an aggregate notion, which refers to the whole system of innovation, or typically a nation or a larger unit of analysis. So what this paper does is that it discusses this topic and it outlines the main objectives and pillars of this research program and the new research directions that it calls for. This is not a paper that provides answers. This is a paper which is quite broad in scope. It is a position paper which intends, first of all, to formulate new questions. And my position in this paper is that I'm interested in exploring the cross-fertilization between the field of innovation research with two important neighboring fields that have so far been largely neglected in Schumpeterian research. One is that of well-being studies, and the other one is the large, traditional, important field of welfare economics. So the position of this paper is basically at the intersection of innovation studies, well-being, and welfare economics. And now we'll now begin with the discussion of the first pillar, the first dimension, the macro pillar of this new agenda, that is the discussion of a broader notion of well-being. I will then shift to the second pillar, and in the last part of the presentation, I would like to have a few considerations and reflections about implications in terms of innovation policy. Now, the first part is about the notion of individual well-being. Drawing inspiration from literature on subjective and objective well-being. Briefly, we know, and the starting point of this is to say that innovation can have broader and a variety of complex effects, both on subjective and objective well-being. Subjective well-being is usually defined as well-being as perceived by each individual, the so-called happiness, sometimes studied in the happiness literature. That is feelings of how each individual perceives her own life or life situation, typically in a long time perspective. On the other hand, objective dimensions of well-being refer to capabilities, functionings, concepts which were developed, for example, by Amartya Sen, and which denote and point to the importance of some objective capabilities which individuals need to have in order to conduct a decent life. Well-being is a multidimensional concept. We know that the determinants of well-being are related to different domains of life. Individuals live life in our work. We earn a wage, and we have relationships in our work. So this delivers on our job satisfaction. Then we consume. Consumption is an important activity of individuals. We live a personal life. So we have leisure, personal life, family, and personal relationships, which are known to be crucial determinants of well-being. And then we have a set of other capabilities and functioning, such as education, health. These are cross-cutting dimensions which are extremely important for our well-being. When we lack these capabilities, such as health, education, this can affect all other functionings in our life. Now, these things are well known in this literature, but the main point here is to say that innovations can have a variety of different effects on well-being in distinct domains of life. There's not much literature that analyzes this, and the literature available on this is quite fragmented. So this first point of the research agenda points out the needs to carry out new research on these topics. I would like to mention some examples now, and these examples are not meant to change the focus of the presentation towards the internet, but simply bring a few examples to illustrate why the concept of well-being is so broad and how innovation can affect it in such a variety of complex ways. So think about one of the main general purpose technologies of our time, the internet, and some of the digital innovations or the applications that individuals have that we take for granted now. And a few years ago, there were digital innovations which are still diffusing worldwide. Let's think about implications of some of these applications for individual well-being. Think about our working life. Telework is not a new topic, is not a new technology, but it has received increased attention in the last few months, in the last couple of years in which we had to work remotely due to COVID restrictions. Telework is a great digital and organizational innovation. It reduces commuting time, it frees up additional leisure time. And if we're able to use this in a productive way, this can be very positive. It provides new opportunities for individual well-being. At the same time, many of us complain, and this month we have complained about the lack of social contacts at work. Offices have been closed. We lack the social contacts and the coffee break with our colleagues and so on. So there is literature pointing out that telework can reduce social capital at the workplace, and it can affect work-family balance with possible negative effects on individual well-being. Second short highlight and example, e-commerce. Consumption activities is a broad and important dimension of individual well-being. And in the last years, by using e-commerce, the way in which we consume has been profoundly affected and changed. E-commerce provides new opportunities to save time in our search for products and services and to get much better information to do our consumption activities. At the same time, increased consumption does not lead to stable and permanent increases in well-being. So very often the increased opportunities that we have due to e-commerce, for instance, they do not correspond to a greater level of subjective or objective well-being. Third example, social relationships, family, friends, social life. Social media platforms deliver new and greater possibilities for social life and communication activities, particularly for persons which are not co-located, which would otherwise have difficulty to communicate. This is great, important for well-being, but at the same time, literature shows that social media also foster social comparisons and raise income aspirations, and they often can present risks for more vulnerable social demographic groups, for instance, teenagers, children, and so on. Next short examples is about public governance and these services. More efficiency and transparency in the provision of public services is extremely important, while at the same time, some argue and point out ethics and privacy concerns in the relationship between state and citizens in the use of digital e-services and information. So what do these examples have in common? Basically, these examples are very simple, and they want to make the point that the relevant effects on individual well-being are at the same time economic and non-economic. Many of the non-economic effects cannot be measured by means of monetary metrics only. They cannot be disregarded anyway. And the second important point is that each type of innovation presents often positive and negative effects on well-being. So very often these contrasting effects can be for the same given individual. So in the few examples that I've noted now, the same technology, the same application can provide both opportunities and challenges for the same individual. This is very difficult to assess. So to what extent does internet and its applications, for example, lead to higher well-being of individuals? Now, going back to the main narrative line. In this first pillar of the research agenda, I argue that an important objective of future research should be to develop in the future a typology, a conceptual typology to classify different types of innovations, depending on the extent to which and the channels through which they affect individuals' well-being. And in particular, I think that three dimensions are important to distinguish innovations from each other. The first is the scope of effects. Some innovations have broad and pervasive impacts on individuals and on their well-being. Other innovations have narrow and limited impacts, which do not affect different domains of life, typically consumption-related innovations. The second dimension is the extent of effects. Some innovations can be thought to have strong impacts on well-being. Others, a relatively weak impact of well-being. Think, for example, of a pharmaceutical innovation or a vaccine. It typically has a strong effect on innovation because it gives the possibility to the individual to improve her health and then in this way continue to function in a larger domain of life. And finally, a third dimension of interest is the time horizon of effects. Some innovations can have short-run transitory impacts. And this is typically the case for consumption-related goods, product differentiation, incremental innovations, and so on. Whereas others can have long-term permanent effects. So my point here is that I think an important objective of future research will be to carry out conceptual and empirical research to classify different types of innovations into different types according to the effects that they have on individual well-being. So we should be bolder in our fields, both as scholars and as policymakers, point out those innovations that can have and are expected to have important effects on well-being, and those that will not. And innovations that do not have a clear effects on well-being can be hampered, regulated, and critically discussed by scholars and policymakers. I'll get back to this critical point later. I will now turn to the second part of my presentation. But before I do that, let me just ask Antonio if there are relevant questions in the chat or anything I should be aware of before I continue.
There is a comment, but I guess we can collect all of them together at the end, given that you still have another 10-15 minutes. So I don't want to break your flow. But of course, I'm sure there will be more later. This first comment was about if you have talked about health status as a possible additional dimension of objective well-being, not just as one of the major determinants of happiness and function, from Mike Joffe from Imperial College.
Okay, I think it's a good suggestion that we get back to this so that we can open up to broader comments and other topics in the end of the presentation. So I'll continue with the second pillar. The second pillar shifts the focus to a more aggregate level of analysis. So the aggregate notion of social welfare. So think of social welfare of a nation, of a country, typically. So this is the topic that we have in mind now in the second part. An innovation moves from a state of the world to a new state of the world, which sometimes is uncertain. So the relevant question for us is to what extent and whether innovation positively impacts welfare. So is the new state of the world characterized by higher and better social welfare compared to the previous state of the world without innovation? In this part, I argue that innovation research should be inspired more systematically by theories and tools developed for ages by welfare economics. In welfare economics, the comparison of welfare in two states of the world typically entails an analysis of two dimensions. One is the efficiency, that is the overall level of income, consumption, well-being that individuals enjoy, and how this grows over time. And the second one is equity, that is how this income and consumption bundle is distributed among agents. Innovation research so far has focused on the efficiency dimension, but we have often and largely neglected the distributional aspects. I suggest in this paper that it would be interesting in our research in innovation to make use of social welfare functions to study the effects of innovation on social welfare. Social welfare functions basically is a conceptual tool used in welfare economics, which creates a correspondence between a given state of the world and the corresponding social welfare. The standard approach in the economics of innovation is to adopt implicitly, and I would like to underline the word implicitly, a simple utilitarian social welfare function. A simple utilitarian social welfare function is one where the aggregate welfare of a country is given by the sum of well-being and utilities of individuals that are in that country. Is a simple sum, so ideally based on a utilitarian philosophy of Jeremy Bentham and others. The idea is to calculate a simple sum which disregards distributional aspects and effects of innovation. As long as an innovation will lead to a higher level of GDP or a higher level of income, in whatever way you like to measure the economic performance, then social welfare will be higher, even if some social groups will be excluded or lose out from this process. But what I propose here, inspired by literature within welfare economics, is the use of a different type of social welfare function, the so-called generalized utilitarian social welfare function. The overall idea here of the social welfare function is that this is a function that does not only sum together individual well-being of all agents composing a population, but also takes into account inequality aversion. So the function is concave, reflecting the fact that an unequal distribution of income or well-being will not be preferred by the policymaker that is analyzing the alternative states of the world. I do not want to focus here in this presentation on the analytical methodological aspects, but just on the overall concept. The generalized utilitarian function is a family of functions which basically focuses on the fact that what is important is to consider the trade-off between efficiency on the one hand and equity on the other. So a policymaker that is adverse to inequality will prefer a state of the world in which there is probably less economic growth, but a more equal distribution of income. To make this suggestion more concrete, I outline two major directions for future research. That is, two problems which I think are interesting to analyze and how they could be analyzed in the future. The first one is the trade-off between innovation and equality. Now, a society that seeks to give an explicit role to distributional aspects will face an important trade-off. If the policymaker or the analyst, the theorist, is willing to take into account distributive aspects of innovation, this means that this will also turn out to reduce the incentives for innovators to invest in R&D in the society as a whole. The reason for this is that in order to reduce inequality effects of innovation, the policymaker basically will have two possibilities. One is to reduce its support to innovators in terms of R&D policy support, for example, ex ante, before the innovation is generated. Alternatively, the policymaker may decide to increase taxes on innovation profits, that is, impose higher taxes on innovation profits in such a way that the tax revenues will be used for distributive policies. In either case, ex ante or ex post type of approach, the implication is that the overall level of R&D and innovation in the system will be lower in a system which is adverse to inequality, compared to a system in which the main focus is on efficiency, economic growth, competitiveness, and so on, which disregards distributive dimension. When I say an efficiency-oriented system, I basically have in mind the type of system that is predominant in our society today, and also implicitly in innovation policy programs. The second theme of importance in the study of the relationship between innovation and its distributive aspects is the relationship between short-term and long-term effects. It is reasonable to say that the effects of innovation on social welfare may change over time. And innovation will affect different social groups, such as winners and losers, differently. And the impact on social welfare of these groups may also change over time. To illustrate this proposition, I would like to point out four stylized cases, very simple examples. The four graphs here, the four quadrants, represent situations in which we have a group of winners and a group of losers from a new technology. So on the y-axis, there are changes in well-being over time, and on the x-axis, I represent time. So for example, the first case is one where the welfare of the winners will increase over time, whereas the costs for the losers will be decreasing over time. It's easier to illustrate this by means of some examples. The first case, ideally, the first conceptual case is one where the winners experience increasing benefits from the use of a technology over time, whereas the losers, the social group that lose from the use of this technology, they have lower costs over time. Think, for example, of green innovation as a general stylized example. Think that the green innovation will initially not be adopted by the incumbents, non-green, dirty incumbents firms, whereas the eco firms will be the early adopters of this new technology. So the eco firms will have increasing benefits over time, and whereas the losers from this process will have initially high cost and then will gradually adapt over time during the course of time and begin to use the new technology and differentiate into green innovation. The second example is one where there is, you can think of decreasing benefits for the winners and higher costs for the losers. Think, for example, of a firm that automates, introducing robots and automating some parts of the production process. Skilled workers will initially have a benefit from this process, will probably improve the way in which their safety at work or their own productivity and wage, whereas some workers will lose their job and be unemployed. However, skilled workers in the longer term will also probably experience also decreasing benefits. They will experience that the automation technologies may also negatively affect them in the long run. They may also lose their job in the long run, and they may experience other types of negative effects later. In these two examples, there is no clear trade-off between social welfare effects of innovation in the short run versus the long run. There is a clear situation in these stylized examples, whereas in the first case, there are stronger welfare effects in the long run, whereas in the second case, there are stronger effects in the short run. There are two other examples that I point out here, which I think are more interesting because they point out a difficult situation and a complex trade-off for policymakers. Imagine a situation where the use of a technology has decreasing benefits for the winners and lower costs for the losers. Think, for example, of the use of social media. The group of winners, like young users, which begin to adopt the new technology early on, will have initially a boost, new opportunities to communicate with each other, and later will experience decreasing returns and lower well-being over time. Whereas elderly users will initially be excluded from the use of this technology and then gradually catch up later and appreciate later the possibilities that these new technologies have. So here there is a difference between the short run and the long run. And finally, one more effect, one final case is the symmetric case, where we can think about increasing benefits for the winners by using a new technology and higher costs for the losers. Think, for example, of a general purpose technology that is diffusing now, such as artificial intelligence. Firms in high-tech, digital-related sectors will experience increasing benefits in terms of productivity and profits over time. But on the other hand, there will be firms which are in other sectors of the economy, which will lose out from this process and gradually be the losers of this process of creative destruction. These two stylized examples point out a possible trade-offs between social welfare effects of innovation in the short run and in the long run. For example, in the first case, we have higher efficiency and more inequalities in the short run, and correspondingly lower efficiency and lower inequalities in the long run. So it is a situation which is difficult to assess for a policymaker and the theorist. My point here is that trade-offs between short-run and long-run welfare effects of innovation are not explicitly studied in innovation research. And this observation calls for new research that will investigate dynamic welfare effects of different types of innovation and how this affects economic performance of different social groups, winners and losers of any given technology. More in general, I think that this also calls for a more explicit policy debate about the ethical foundations of innovation policy. What is the theory of social justice that provides the rationale and the foundation for specific policy interventions? This is a question that is seldom discussed in theory and in policy debates, and I think this is really important. I will elaborate slightly on this in the last part of the presentation, which however will be shorter, so I will conclude within just a few minutes. What are the implications of these reflections for innovation policy? In my opinion, the new research agenda that I'm discussing with you today will have important implications for R&D and innovation policy, and particularly for the foundations. They call for a radical shift and rethinking of the rationale and the foundations of innovation policy. In the paper, I have a table which compares ideas and implications of the new approach developed in this paper with the three dominant paradigms in innovation policy, at least conceptual paradigms providing the foundations of innovation policy. One of them is R&D policy, which we know comes from mainstream growth theory and mainstream economics. The second one is systemic policy based on the innovation system approach. And then the more recent approach, which is attracting much attention today, the mission-oriented innovation policy approach, which is based on notions from evolutionary economics and the idea and theory of the entrepreneurial state. I try to compare and to contrast the possible implications of the ideas presented in this paper with these three dominant paradigms to reflect upon what different foundations there can be. And I briefly point them out as follows. The theoretical foundation here would be to get a cross-fertilization between innovation studies on the one hand, and then well-being studies and welfare economics on the other. The main rationale of innovation policy would be, according to these reflections, to foster individuals' well-being and enhance social welfare. So the objectives of innovation policy would be to support the development and the diffusion of innovations which enhance well-being and social welfare, but on the other hand, hamper, tax, and regulate limited diffusion of innovations which we know do not lead to individuals' well-being and social welfare, and particularly those that exacerbate income inequality. In this approach, I do not point out typical instruments, but rather the fact that policy instruments should target technologies differently, depending on the welfare effects that we expect from these innovations. So instruments can be the same as pointed out and used in previous approaches, taxes, supports, and many others. But what is important is that the instruments should be specifically targeting technologies depending on the effects that they are supposed to have on individual well-being. I'm aware of how complex this research is going to be and how complex the policy implications are likely to be. This is a conceptual framework which will highlight multidimensionality. Well-being is a multidimensional aspect. And then it will highlight complex trade-offs between efficiency, equity, short-run effects, and long-run effects. So I expect it will be very hard to derive simple models and policy rules. And this is a potential drawback, of course, to develop this approach and make it into a working and effective paradigm. I conclude. As I said, the paper has sought to outline the main objectives and pillars of a new research agenda to study innovation and social welfare. It's a paper that points out new questions, but it does not have answers to all of these questions. So the answers will be inspiration for future research. This new agenda will seek to develop a conceptual framework to adopt, first of all, a broader and more inclusive notion of individual well-being and how innovation impacts this. And secondly, the agenda will study explicitly the distributional impacts of innovation, considering at the same time efficiency and equity effects of innovation, and how these can be in contrast with each other, leading to trade-offs from time to time.
Thanks so much, Fulvio.
I will now stop sharing and look forward to hearing from you and discussing this further.
Thanks so much. I think it was a very analytically provoking set of propositions that already spur lots of reaction from the audience. So I'll refrain myself from making comments. I'll pass directly to Rainer, and then I will invite some of those who have already started raising questions and comments to join the panel for sharing those. Just before I pass the word to Rainer, just to remind people that they can use the Q&A function and also the raise hand function to join the discussion after Rainer has delivered his discussion comments. Rainer.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, seeing that there is so much interest in the audience, I'll also be relatively brief and leave time for, as we have only 35 minutes left. Yeah, I think it's a wonderful topic and really important topic, definitely. And I think, as you say, Fulvio, something that innovation studies really hasn't been focusing on. There is only a handful of papers that really directly discuss this topic. So in that sense, I think it's wonderful. I have basically like 3 comments that are probably quite similar in their direction, I think. And the first one is about the when we talk about innovation impact, I think you sort of, I think a lot of your discussion is with sort of the mainstream assumptions around innovation growth. At the same time, perhaps I think there's also a lot to be gained from perhaps even engaging more with sort of the evolutionary basics of innovation. That is, it isn't, the impact of innovation is also the feedback loop and everything like that is very evolutionary. So in terms of who's winning and who's losing, this is also, as you show in your models, there's for examples, I think that's already there. But I wonder whether actually we should so much focus on types of innovation as we should just perhaps as types of feedback loops that generate this winners and losers in terms of analyzing, and maybe that's an easier route analytically. Because as I say, if you try to have a typology of innovation, you sort of end up with having that they have both positive and negative. But maybe if you focus on sort of these feedback loops, which we can sort of gain from the evolutionary nature of innovation. So that would be my one comment. And the second comment is about, I think you're very focused on the impacts of innovation, but I think we can also ask the sort of like the preconditions of innovations. Like, for instance, in many societies, ethnic groups or gender-based groups or racial groups have less access to university education, for instance, or access to capital, access to whatnot. So there is well, of course, there's also feedback loops from that in a sense, from innovation impacting these groups differently. But I think there's something about preconditions to innovation as well. Like, for instance, the 10 presidencies work in Israel and looking at Israeli and Palestinians and how they can access and use innovation policy funding and whatnot. I think is an interesting example of looking at, especially I think class and race and are such an important aspects of innovation that perhaps you didn't focus so much on, but implicitly, of course, you discuss them as well. But maybe it can be made more explicit, as it were. And the third one, I think there's already like a comment in a chat as well around this, efficiency or growth and equity or inequality. And I think there's maybe there is more to be said about sort of decoupling innovation and growth, in a sense that if you look at today, there's so much discussion in climate around, for instance, how should we behave in terms of like, for instance, eating less meat. Obviously, it will have an impact not only on sort of value change, but also, of course, has an impact on who can grow, who can allow to eat less meat, basically, because it might much more expensive to eat, vegan or vegetarian food, and so it's again it has this sort of a bias, if you will, in there, and the same with if you think about that, cities should have less cars. But again, who has access to the city and how do you have access to the city? So I think when we sort of juxtaposing innovation, growth, and inequality, I think maybe there's something to be said about sort of decoupling these sort of circles. And if you look at feminist economics and things like that, or even degrowth, for instance, would be one of those areas where there could be like useful inspiration, perhaps, to your discussion as well, and or even to build bridges to these kind of discussions. I think might be interesting as well, especially I think in economic geography and urban planning, urban economics, where there's a lot of discussion about decoupling innovation and growth, and that might be a useful avenue as well. But yeah, these are my 3 comments. They're probably all the same comments, actually, just in 3 different ways. But thanks so much, and I'll look forward to the discussion and other people from the audience as well.
Thanks, Rainer. Fulvio, while you address eventually briefly Rainer's comments, I'll bring to the panel 3 people who have already raised comments and questions. So while you speak, people will be joining, so they will then have the rapid round of questions and comments. Please.
I'll take just a few seconds while you invite the other discussants.
Sure.
Just to say thank you very much, Rainer, for these comments. These push me in the direction of thinking of broader implicit assumptions, which I do not discuss in the paper, contextualize, make it better. So it will be important. I would like to have a short reflection about the third point that you have mentioned, and actually to extend a little bit these points. So the one about decoupling innovation, growth, inequalities. You mentioned the topic of, for example, environmental change, consumption patterns, and so on. And then a short reflection on that, based on the topic, on a recent paper published by Ulrich Witz in Ecological Economics this year. It's an interesting paper and reflects upon the following question. In order to reduce climate change and contrast these negative effects, one thing that is often advocated is to change consumption patterns. And then what Ulrich Witz discusses in this paper is to what extent and whether this will affect well-being. We often are very scared about that we will have to change our consumption patterns, consume less, and so on. What will be the cost of the society of changing consumption patterns? But Witz takes a very interesting approach, which I think is very reasonable. I would like to mention it here, saying that Basically, what is important to look at are the basic motives for consumption, the reasons why individuals consume. And then there are two very different types of motives and reasons why we consume. One of them is to fulfill basic needs. Basic needs are very important for all of us. They're related to our instincts, to our human nature. And these are particularly important for individuals and countries at the lower level of economic development. But for individuals which are at the above a given level of development, for industrialized countries, countries of high GDP per capita and so on, then providing higher GDP per capita, more consumption possibilities will not deliver higher well-being. We know that from empirical literature, the Easterlin paradox and so on. And then correspondingly, reducing our consumption, if this is a collective effort, this will not likely affect our well-being in a significant way. On the other hand, Witt also says in the same article also that the second motive for consumption is consumption for status, to increase our status, to be better than our peers, increase our prestige, relative position in the society. And this is also something that should absolutely be considered as a possible target of authorities and policies, because in the long run, limiting consumption possibilities which are motivated by status will not affect our well-being in the long run. And actually, this is something that will likely improve social welfare. So in short, what Witt says in this article is that what we often fear as possible negative effects on well-being of decrease in consumption and changing consumption patterns is not something that is based conceptually in literature, in empirical literature about well-being studies. I wanted to mention that it's not exactly an answer to Rainer's point, but it's an extension of his third reflection.
Thanks, Fulvio. I'm trying to bring in the people who raised their hand, and Michael, Geoff, and Ariel are already here. I'm trying, Xenia, to allow you to talk as well. For some reason, it doesn't seem to be possible to bring you to the main panel, but I will allow you to talk as well if you have a question specific to Fulvio. So Michael and Ariel, would you like to raise your comments and questions?
Hello, thank you very much for the talk. I found it really fascinating, and I'm planning to email you afterwards about getting a copy of the paper and so on, because it's really valuable, some very, very valuable thoughts in there. I actually sent in two questions. One is the one that Antonio read out a while ago, and it's about health status. That the well-being literature is about, as you say, subjective well-being, and then there's also the what you call the objective dimension of functioning and so on, the Amartya Sen capabilities approach. But in addition, health is actually really, really important. I would say it should be along there with other aspects of well-being as a criterion. It's also a determinant of things like happiness and functioning as well. But I think it should be a criterion of equal status or even greater status. So that's my first question is would you consider, and if so, how would you consider integrating health into this health status? I don't mean healthcare services, I'm talking about health status as an outcome. And the second one, I'm trying to remember what it was. The second one, was the trade-off between innovation and inequality. I'm certainly accept that is commonly the case. In fact, I had difficulties initially of thinking of exceptions, but I don't think it's inevitable. I think there could be innovations which actually decrease inequality, and you might want to consider that in your agenda as something to aim at. When I did come up with, just briefly, an example, my first thought was bicycle, which apart from some transient effects, perhaps at the beginning where some people could afford them and others couldn't. The example I came up with was if you have a factory or some source of pollution in a country or a region, having an innovation that stops that pollution and has no other economic effects, that would actually reduce inequality. So it's about the inevitability of the trade-off.
Thanks, Michael. Let's try to keep it brief so that we allow everyone to, Ariel, please, and then Olga.
Thank you, Fulvio, for a wonderful presentation. I look forward also to reading the paper. My question has to do with some of the assumptions you make about the economic system in which the innovation is made and how innovation is financed. I'm not an academic, I'm a practitioner, and I've been working in the field for quite some time on the social enterprise side of things. And what I've been seeing recently is the growth of worker-owned cooperatives and of distributed accountability organizations, or DAOs, in what's seen as the Web3 or crypto space. And it seems to me that there are new models of more distributed innovation that are taking the place of what venture capital has more or less captured as a VC-based innovation space over the past 20 to 30 years. So I'd love it if you could reflect on that, or perhaps speak to why you chose the assumption of kind of what is admittedly right now the dominant form of innovation, but whether you've addressed some of these more emerging aspects of distributed economic stakeholdership.
Thanks. And Fulvio, if you don't mind, I get Olga. She has a quick question. I think it's an important one, but Olga, please join us, and then we'll have another round later on.
Thank you very much, Fulvio, for presentation. Indeed, very thought-provoking, and indeed, innovation studies would so much benefit from becoming more synthesizing with different other subdisciplines or streams of literature. My question is really small. The rapidly emerging field of just transitions, do you think that it might be useful in addressing, let's say, the question of ethics, or to some extent distribution, not in terms of only looking at, let's say, displacement of workers and compensation, for example, how ILO might see it, but in a broader terms from particularly industrial innovation policy perspective? Thank you.
Thanks, Olga. Fulvio, back to you.
Perhaps I could pick up briefly a couple of these questions, and then, try not to take too much time. It's very interesting to hear your insights and comments, and thank you very much. I would say I perfectly agree with Michael that health should be an important dimension here. So I think that in studies of well-being, both subjective and objective and others, health is a central dimension and determinant of well-being. So although this is not so much emphasized in this paper and in this talk, the underlying idea is that innovations that affect health and other types of capabilities as well should be really important to increase individual well-being. So in a way, and they would be much more important compared to other innovations, product innovations, incremental innovations, which affect, for example, consumption, which will not lead to a permanent increase, stable increase of well-being. So I totally agree with the suggestion that health should be a key dimension here, and that the innovation that affects health are crucial to shape and foster individual well-being. Michael asks also a second question, which I think is partly related to Ariel's question too, which is about what I miss in this paper. This is a paper which has probably a type of formulating the argument in a more academic way, an economist of innovation criticizing the literature and looking at new directions. By doing that, I miss some important concrete phenomena and examples, like Michael mentions innovations that decrease inequality. Ariel means cooperatives, new models of innovation, social innovation. So I agree with you that this is something that is not here because this is a paper which has focus more on the academic, on the criticism of the academic literature, and I miss partly this type of new models or emerging things. So I think I will try to keep this in mind to make my argument more nuanced and the examples a little bit less standard. Olga, you asked briefly about the question. It was about just transition or sustainable transition. Could you please very briefly tell me again your key points?
I just probably referred to the emerging literature on the just transitions. I mean, it's I think there are various definitions there. There is no one way of understanding it, but when we look at, let's say, policy advocacy or let's say policy reports, let's say I refer to broader notion of justice, not just in terms of, let's say, International Labor Organization understands it, protecting displaced workers, but in a very more broader terms, we can look at how UNCTAD is writing about this and touching upon a broader structural questions that we have an opportunity to address if we further engage in this conversation. What is that green transition? How to do it in a just way, you know, taking into account vulnerable groups, global north-south dimensions, all that stuff. So I wonder if perhaps it can bring inspiration into the integrated framework you're proposing in terms of discussion.
Right. Yeah. Thank you very much, Olga. So now I get the point better. This is very important because I think this is in line a bit with the point that I make in this paper that in a way we lack this type of debates within innovation studies. By focusing on efficiency, net effects of innovation on economic performance, we lack an explicit discussion about social theories of justice. What is the social theory of justice that policymakers implicitly adopt when we formulate our programs on R&D, fiscal deductions, policy support, and so on? So we lack this type of approach, and I think your suggestion is precisely in line with my call that these are things that we should discuss more clearly and make more explicit in our discussion with policymakers.
Excellent. Thanks, Fulvio. We have a question from Valeria Bastos. I tried to invite her to join to the panel, but it was not possible. I tried one last time. Before I do that, Jacopo, would you like to raise your question? You raise your hand to join.
Oh yeah, thank you very much, Antonio, and thank you, Fulvio, for this very inspiring presentation. I did some work on the distributional effects of innovation in the field of economics of innovation. And what I would be interested in pillar 2 is how would you address the difficulties in measuring both, not just innovation, but also a distributional effects, because there is some work on income, for example, but still with some data problems as well. And what would be also interesting is then the relation to wealth, but also your other indicators of well-being, which I think it's a very, very important extension of the work which is there now, mostly talking on technical change or technological change more than innovation.
Fulvio, I'm going to allow Valeria to ask a question. So Valeria, please. If you unmute yourself, we can. If not, if you can look at the Q&A chart, Valeria was asking, don't you think that the neo-Brownian approach tries to tackle the traditional theoretical trade-off between intellectual property and antitrust to a new approach that considers the long-term effects on society's well-being and not just the short-term individual benefits term of innovation in the digital economy? So I guess here we are in the digital space, relationship between intellectual property and antitrust. Would you like to address these two? And then eventually I'll, if there are no other questions, I have a couple of questions myself.
Well, I think Valeria's question, I'm not familiar with that, frankly, so I would not be able to elaborate. I will try to read the question in chat and see if I can provide more reflections later. On Jacob, so Jacob, you're asking, if I understand correctly, some reflections upon how empirically we could measure this relationship between innovation and inequality effects. Because you're right to say that one of the reasons why there is scant literature about inequality effects of innovation is also that it's partly difficult to measure inequality. We can measure income inequality, and then other dimensions are sometimes difficult to mention. My general suggestion that I very briefly mentioned in the paper is that I think it would be possible to carry out empirical research by using a variety of available data sources, that is surveys about households' well-being. These are surveys that are available worldwide for across countries for many thousands of individuals in different countries, but also in individual country as panels. So basically, these are surveys that ask individuals about a variety of dimensions which relate to their well-being: health status, social relationships, income groups, and many other things. Just to mention one, the Eurobarometer for European countries is one of them. Then there is the World Value Survey, the European Social Survey, and many, many others in different countries. So the idea would be to link this type of the type of dimensions and determinants of well-being. We can find a variety of indicators there, which have already been exploited in the literature on well-being, and try to link them with variables measuring individuals' use of new technologies. So I think carrying out studies at the regional level or at the sectoral level or even at the country level, it would be possible to combine measures of innovation, adoption and use of different type of technologies on the one hand, and then measures of individuals' subjective well-being, and how these are distributed over time. So it would be possible to construct multidimensional indicators of inequality, poverty, and so on. So not an easy research program, but I think that there is a lot of data available, also publicly available on the web, which would make it possible not only to measure income inequality within each country, but also inequality in the distribution of other dimensions of well-being.
If I may come in once again, it is true that there is some possibility. I mean, it's always a question on how many countries to include and how many years to include to have like a valid effects in the end in a regression design. However, what about innovation? Because, for example, what many studies on the relation of income inequality and technological change do is using patents, for example, which is quite obviously not the best measure for innovation, also considering all the the usage of patents, for example, and strategies of large companies using that. What else would you use? Because that's like a major question in economics of innovation, how to actually measure innovation, kind of the holy grail to do it properly.
No, I think very briefly, this is very interesting discussion. I think many studies within the economics of innovation empirically focus on the supply side. So using patents, R&D indicators, community innovation surveys, and so on. But I think what I have in mind is rather to shift the focus to the user side. So individual households using new technologies. For example, there is a variety of indicators and statistics about use of digital technologies, for example. Health is also another type of dimension where we could have in different countries access to data about use of and consumption on pharmaceutical innovation products and so on. So in a way, the idea would be to link, on the one hand, data and new indicators about consumption and use of new technologies, not the production side and the supply side. So not so much patents and R&D, but rather how the use and consumption of new technologies of individuals is related to outcomes and well-being.
Very interesting approach. Thank you.
Great. I don't see other questions. So I take the liberty to just raise a couple of points. You started, when you introduced the challenge that we had in the more traditional neoclassical utilitarianist kind of approach, reminded me very much of Amartya Sen program, right? The research program was very much trying to propose an alternative welfare ideas that started with, of course, with all the capability ideas building on the basic needs from the 70s up to the recent work where we try to develop the theory of justice and the dialogue between that approach and the more, if you want, prescriptive approach that Martha Nussbaum put forward. Some of the discussion we're having now when Michael said we should have health there, right? Already points out that problem of when we look at these dimensions of well-being, of this sort of syndrome of developing lists of dimensions. And of course, then the follow-up problem is what is the hierarchy among these dimensions, what matter most, and so on. And this is an unresolved problem, of course, in the capability approach. And I think one of the first examples you gave about, also a different way of having a social welfare form that introduced an element of aversion to inequality, again, reminded me very much this big trouble that the human development approach had. When the human development approach discovered that the index was using, traditional income measures adjust for, weighted with different forms, but for and considering, life expectancy, education, but was not including anything about actually inequality per se, right? So if you look at 2011, the big change in the Human Development Index was to factor in some element of inequality into that. And I think that is an interesting trajectory. My question is really how far we go with that, because in a sense, economists tend to remain quite anchored in a quite traditional Manchester liberal individualistic type of way of understanding well-being, right? Which means that that element of inequality is an attempt to capture some element of some quality of well-being that is, beyond the individual, right? By definition, inequality, you need to have more than one people to be involved, right? So there is a systemic element there or dimension that it's quite difficult to capture, but that actually it's very relevant. And there has been a big debate in the capability approach around, how do we remain anchored to an individualistic version, which is augmented by multiple dimensions or multiple lists, or we try to factor in some element of also collective dimension or systemic dimension, like along the lines of inequality. And I think that becomes relevant, especially when you start looking at how, in different contexts, the relationship that you're trying to explain and the dark side of innovation, the context becomes the functional element that create divergence in terms of outcome, right? So you're very heterogeneous in terms of the same innovation might have different positive, negative impact in terms of the functional form that you have once you introduce a mediating factor, which is the context, the structure, institutional setting in which these things operate. So I'm a bit concerned about economists running immediately and saying, well, let's run lots of cross-country regression around how do we capture this, right? And we go back to the conceptual problems that we had before. So that is the how much you are thinking to include some of these elements if beyond that social welfare function, which of course has the more traditional form, in a Pareto advanced version of Pigouvian form of welfare economics. And the last point is really connected to this issue again of what does it mean to unpack this relationship, these functional forms, if we need to think more in terms of thresholds and tipping points, more than simply in terms of winners and losers. What I mean is that many of the relationships that we are describing might be non-significant or almost meaningless in terms of the real impact on the well-being for people who have overcome a certain type of threshold. For people who have below that threshold, that could be actually a completely different story, right? So that we are not on the same function. We have a scalar type of situation. And so how you capture something like that, because this is a big problem when we compare dimensions of well-being across countries who have dramatically different levels of development, right? And the bias is always that we end up saying, oh, well, you know, material wealth doesn't really matter too much, but it doesn't matter too much when a certain threshold is passed, right? If material wealth, and not just individual, but collective, you know, wealth is actually not reaching the threshold, they might matter much more in terms of the functioning and capability. So these three questions, which are, I think, quite interconnected, but it would be very interesting to hear your thoughts about it.
Very nice, very nice. So I think these questions, like others that I've received today, they're very nice because in a way they show how difficult this agenda is going to be, but also at the same time engaging. It opens up questions, topics for research. So what you say about, for example, different hierarchy of dimensions, which are the dimensions that matter more for well-being, and so how innovation can affect them. So there, I think that as innovation scholars, we have much to learn about this from exactly from the type of debates and the type of academic studies that you mentioned. Then I think in the subjective well-being literature, my reading is that, for example, there is an emphasis on the importance of social relationships, much more than income and consumption as dimensions of well-being. And so health, educational capabilities are also very important dimensions of well-being. So the discussion about hierarchy of dimensions, which is the relative weight which we should give to a set of commodities, to a bundle, to a large vector of aspects which characterizes each individual, which of them should receive higher weight, more importance? This is an entirely open question. I think we have much to learn about this from existing literature, but there is no clear answer to that, as you say. So I would agree with that. The main interest would be to look at this debate exactly from the point of view of innovation, and to say, when we foster innovation or policymakers promote innovations which would have clearly positive effects on health on the one hand, or on consumption, product differentiation and variety on the other, this type of innovation will likely have different effects on well-being according to what we know in this literature. So there are no clear answers, but we have good starting points based on existing empirical literature, some of that that you have mentioned now in this interesting question. The second about the collective dimension, this is something that I do not discuss here. So what I do is a more type of conservative standard narrative line where I say that let's look first at the micro approach. What are the determinants of well-being, where each individual does not care about the distribution of income or commodities. And then we look at the more aggregate level, where is the policymaker or the theorist to judge and to give an assessment of the distribution of income capabilities within the society. So I have analytically distinguished the two. But as you say, of course, correctly, it's important also to elaborate this more and to say that it can also be that the discussion should be more complex. Individuals often care about inequalities, distribution, fairness. And so in a way, this can also be an argument in their utility function or another determinant of well-being, if I understand correctly your point. So I think this is an extension, something that is outside of the framework that I've developed until now. And finally, your last point is also important because this allows me to clarify that I think my considerations are fairly biased towards countries, societies characterized by a high level of economic development. In societies which are below a given threshold, where individuals still have to pursue fulfill basic material needs in terms of health, education, consumption, housing. Of course, many of the criticism that I move to this traditional approach based on income and efficiency, they would not hold. My consideration, my criticisms hold to the extent that we are looking at societies, affluent societies such as Norway, the UK, and so on, in which most individuals likely have already the possibility to fulfill basic needs, and then a higher level of consumption, material wealth over time will not deliver greater well-being. So thinking about the Easterlin paradox, my point of view is the one focuses on the above thresholds type of societies. But I agree with you that when we look at the developing world, then the discussion would be more complex, and some of my criticism would probably not hold, because their income and consumption are very important determinants over well-being when agents have to satisfy basic needs.
And of course, considering that in the UK we have massive resurgence of cases of poverty, diffuse poverty, and so on. Of course, the more society becomes unequal and poverty becomes a phenomenon that is actually quite widespread also in our society, that challenge even more this agenda. So thanks so much. I think it was an excellent discussion, and we had a very stimulating set of propositions from you, Fulvio, that I'm sure will stick with quite a few of us, and hope we'll have a chance to continue this conversation. Thanks everyone for joining tonight, and we will have another seminar in a couple of weeks' time, as usual, Wednesday, and this time we will be moving to a very close topic, actually, on windows of green opportunities with Rasmus Lem. Thanks so much again to everyone, and see you in a couple of weeks.